Thank you guys very much for joining. We'll start with Doug. One of the things, obviously, there was an election Tuesday, some market uncertainty for that. There's a lot of noise during the actual night about the markets going down. Then magically the next day they popped back. But how should private companies be thinking about financing and sort of, given all the noise, post Tuesday?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's obviously on all of our minds. The election was very disappointing for me personally. Most of my family lives in Ohio and was actually working on the campaign. But for me professionally, and I think for our startup companies, I actually see relatively little impact, at least in the short term. Obviously, long term, we need to see what happens with policy around trade and interest rates, which could affect eventually money coming into venture capital and the ability to take companies public. But from a financing perspective and a kind of what are we doing today perspective, I see very little that's changing. Obviously, we all talk about immigration policy, and that's always been hard. And I certainly don't see that getting any easier. And it's a big issue for our companies, attracting and being able to recruit great engineering and talent otherwise. I think that's going to continue to be hard. But otherwise, I don't see a big impact, at least in the early stage venture business.
Is anyone else on the panel have a different perspective around, or you'd offer one of your portfolio companies sort of supplemental or different advice regarding how you would approach the current market?
Well, I think anytime there's additional volatility, it's hard to say that Trump doesn't add volatility to the capital markets. Maybe leave that extra nickel on the table, and if you need money, go secure it. So I think on the new deal side, we're very similar. We invest over 5 to 7 year time horizon, so nothing's changed at all, or very little. But for the portfolio, I'd certainly take the money if you can get it.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a good point to add. The volatility, that's always an issue.
So Stacey, we've heard first panel today, and even this afternoon, and even our one about China. Obviously, big push of private equity into the marketing technology space. What impact do you think that'll have on the space more broadly? And also, I'm curious to get your take, because you sort of scale the close to that. What's your prognostications on the companies that have been acquired around what we're going to see in terms of whether it's M&A or more broadly from an ecosystem impact?
Whether we'll see more M&A?
Well, we'll see more, and also, you heard him talking about, as someone who's been on the receiving end of private equity, the challenge of trying to continue to grow your business but keep those EBITDA margins. What does that change in terms of running these companies?
Right. Well, I think there's two questions in that, and whether or not you'll see more M&A. I mean, clearly we've seen a lot of M&A in marketing tech. It has to do with kind of the big marketing platforms being very acquisitive. It's always a great market when there's 3 or 4 people all kind of trying to build out this platform, and that's what we've seen over the past few years, and I think that will continue. And I think we heard earlier about the Marketo discussion, and that creates a new buyer, because I think it was Brian who said he was very surprised when it happened, and I was as well, that Marketo was getting picked up by private equity, because it's not normally what you think that they'll be willing to pay those prices. So that's all good news. As far as the growth versus profitability, that's a second whole question, and that's always, in my opinion, the company's ability to access capital at good prices. If they can access capital and they know they can consistently, and their efficiencies are in place with their sales and marketing spend, then it's worth continuing to get more of that. If those aren't aligned and either churn spikes or some dynamic happens, or you don't think you can get capital, then you want to get to cash flow break even, as soon as possible. So understanding as a company what those levers are, how much time would it take for you to get to cash flow break even if you couldn't get more cash? That's always smart business sense to have kind of those two models running those numbers.
Dave, how do you look at that?
If you think about auction dynamics, right? When you guys exit, you want a big, robust auction. Luma's great at creating these situations. Pricing set by the incremental bidder. So I think private equity is great. I think having incremental bidders in the auction can move the pricing quite a bit. I think private equity buyers, they're always on buyers. There's no risk around organizational change, around champions losing jobs or changing roles. And they're pretty financially oriented. So if you have good financial metrics, you'll get a deal done. So I think private equity is just great for the sell side of our business.
Great. So Rajeev, one of the, we've had a lot of exits in the space, particularly a lot of the quote unquote 1.0 players have sold, whether it be to big strategic buyers or to private equity, or have merged with other players in the broader ecosystem. How do you evaluate a new entrant, investing in a new entrant in a space when the 1.0 player has sold?
So I think it's, we always look at how big the market opportunity is, and also look at when markets are actually ready, right? And so market timing and market size, market opportunity are two big considerations. And oftentimes the 1.0 players that get acquired sort of early in the cycle usually create or unlock the true opportunity in the market. And we often say at Mayfield, it's not about being first to market, but it is about being right first to market. Right? And so marketing automation, for example, is a space that people have thought about for 20 years, right? And market timing just wasn't right till probably about 6-7 years ago. And so there were a slew of companies that many we had never even heard of that were created, and I'd consider those maybe 1.0 companies. Doug and I were both fortunate to be involved with Marketo. And in some ways, the 1.0 company in the space was Eloqua. And Eloqua being acquired really opened up the opportunity even more so for Marketo and for HubSpot and others. So I think it's about getting the timing right. And oftentimes, if the market opportunity is large enough, the 1.0 players are a place to really learn a lot about the market and understand the dynamics and really see what the opportunity is. So being a fast follower or follower in a space, if you look at it from a long-term standpoint, always works.
Doug?
Yeah, I'll give another perspective on that, or maybe another anecdote. There was a sort of, it's 1.0 or 2.0, or I sometimes call it first generation and second generation companies in a space. And we all saw, as social was exploding, this emergence of companies that were helping CMOs address the needs of bringing their brand to social. And we all remember the 1.0 companies, first generation companies like Involver and Vitru and Buddy Media that grew very, very quickly, did a nice job. And I looked at all those companies and decided that ultimately they didn't have the sustainable solutions. And at about that time, a new next generation set of companies came along called Spreadfast and Sprinkler that I believed were real software businesses that could address the complex workflow of large enterprises dealing with all of the data and interactions on social. And it's turned out now that those second generation companies are going to be much more valuable than the first generation. And I think that's, to Rajeev's point, quite common in these markets.
Stacey?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, exactly. Perfect. That one, because we were in one of the 1.0s, which got acquired, and I didn't think to invest in a 2.0, and they ended up doing phenomenal. They're doing really well in the market. So I think oftentimes when the companies are picked up by the big buyers, perhaps the innovation, there's less innovation. They're, trying to fit within the needs of the large enterprise that they got acquired by, and sort of the startup can be nimble and add, whether it be a broader suite or more focused marketing, whatever that is, they have a chance to be successful. So it certainly doesn't scare us away when the wave has happened. But it does take acquirers out of the market for a period of time, but not forever.
Great. Speaking of next, what are some of your thoughts on what the next round of marketing technology investments will be? We'll start with Rajeev.
So I think there's two opportunities from my perspective. One is, which technologies really work, right? Like what delivers me an ROI or efficacy, and it's not about necessarily big data or analytics or insights. All those themes are, those are, I think, just enabling ideas. But the question is, what truly helps me drive marketing performance? So there's a whole way to sort of think about that. And the second area I would say is, I call it sort of the integration problem in marketing, right? There's so many solutions now, and there's so much fragmentation, and I think companies that can try to address the problem of bringing those things together, harmonizing it. That occurs both at the application level, at the data level, at the channel level, user experience level. I think those are another set of interesting opportunities. Another area that I think is pretty interesting is we're obviously having a lot of conversations around content marketing, but it's around content efficacy, content measurement. But I would also add another dimension, which is content credibility. And that's a slightly different idea than...
Became very relevant Tuesday.
It became very relevant on Tuesday. It's actually very relevant, right? I mean, what do you believe, right? I mean, and that's, I think, I don't know how that problem gets solved, but Google certainly solved the problem of relevancy.
Sure.
The question is,
how do you... in the social world, yeah.
Yeah, what is that in the social and the content world? How do you actually assign credibility to content that you're consuming?
Great. Stacey?
Yeah, so I'll add, I mean, those are all good areas too, but also where you can apply machine learning to marketing data. I mean, we all know that marketing creates a ton of data, just every click, everything that's going on. How can you use machine learning to analyze all of that and create true personalized marketing? I mean, there was a lot of messaging around that, I think 5 years ago or so. Dave and I were both an exact target, but it wasn't necessarily coming fully to reality of being able to truly do it. And I think you're seeing a lot more of that today. And then also just understanding like marketing spend, as you mentioned, the data issue, but how can you get a picture of where everything's going? I think marketers are challenged with so many vendors out there, and how do they choose which ones to work with and what's working for them?
Yeah, perhaps investors are all lemmings because we're hunting in the same grounds. I think
that's good for everyone here.
Yeah, so. I think if you think about just within marketing tech, going from single channel to multi-channel, going from marketing tech and integrating into ad tech, vendor vision is great, but even in amongst aggregation of marketing clouds, each application has their own customer database that they haven't integrated the data models together in. So I think even in really basic use cases, this notion of data integration is foundational. And I think historically it's been a services market, which we were a big investor in Merkle, and we were excited to do that. But I think as it moves to the next level, to cloud and to software, I think that's a great foundational piece. Then you have application layers on top of that, whether it's optimization and media buying, whether it's attribution. There's a whole wide range of how you play on top of that core foundation, but that's a big area. I think the only channel play I've been really looking at lately has been on the native side. I think most of the native models have generally been more ad tech and frankly playing different ARBs, and which I think sub-optimizes the real opportunity, which is I think the monetization platforms of the future are going to be like Google Search, Pinterest, LinkedIn Recruiter, where the consumer value proposition is really harmonized to the monetization model, and they're interlocked, and what's the ad product that supports that, and how do publishers and marketers take advantage of that. I think that's a big opportunity.
Yeah, these guys have said most everything, I think. So I'll just say AI, ML, no. No, I mean, to me, if I back up to a higher level, in the end, what's exciting and what creates new opportunities for startups and for venture investors is the emergence of new platforms. And when we saw email becoming really interesting, we invested in companies. When we saw social, we invested in social. And when we saw mobile emerging, we made investments in Appaway and other companies like that. And the reason is that when consumers are changing where they spend their time, marketers and enterprises need to follow them. And so that creates the opportunity to create new businesses to address those needs. And there's big companies that have been created in every one of those new platforms. And so the question is, what are the big new platforms now that we can invest behind? We've talked about some of those today, but clearly consumers are spending a tremendous amount of time on messaging, right? They're spending a lot of time on live video. What's going to happen with virtual reality over the next few years? These are areas that consumers are changing their behavior, and businesses and marketers need to match that and be there with those consumers. So some of those are going to be a long time out. I think messaging is here now. Those solutions have not been proven yet, but they're going to happen quickly because that's where the consumers are. And so we're spending time in all of those emerging platforms looking for the next marketing technology to address those needs.
Great. One thing, Dave, you brought up, which sort of I always find interesting and curious to hear some reactions on, is about business model. So you talked about services versus the software. Obviously, great result with Merkle, which is clearly a services business with some technology. And then you obviously have invested in companies that are more software-based, sort of software-driven. How do you think about that as you're looking at the market? Do you shy away from one or the other, or do you see opportunities, given the fact that at least in this space, services is a dirty word?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, services is a dirty word, ad tech's a dirty word. There's a whole lot of pejorative terms that companies get labeled with. But I think you start with what's the customer problem, what's the right solution, and so. In the case of Merkle, back in 2010, we felt like the integration of customer data and really operationalizing it was fundamentally a tech-enabled service delivery model. There weren't real software companies. There was ETL companies, but those were fundamentally tech-enabled services themselves. They just presented themselves as a software P&L. Mm-hmm. You figure out what the right solution is, and if that business model has stickiness and therefore enterprise value, and then also has access to high margin, high flow-through revenues, which Merkle has, ExactTarget did, Sitecore did as well, AppNexus does. It sort of doesn't matter what kind of pejorative or positive term these companies are associated with it. They deliver value for important customers. They have enterprise value and stickiness. They get to high margin. That makes for a good investment. So that's how we look at it. We're less concerned around what public markets think about certain models versus others.
Great. Any other thoughts?
No, I mean, I think the more you go up the enterprise, the more services that are required. So I think you're always seeing this kind of mix. I mean, if you're selling to the mid-market, or even take HubSpot. HubSpot has like no services basically, because it's basically turn it on and it works because it's focused on the SMB market. But as you go up market, we saw this with ExactTarget, so going from the market to the high end, they added services over time. So I think to service enterprise customers with all these data integrations, you definitely need some level of service.
And what advice do you guys offer around speaking of sort of self-service versus not? In talking to folks today, there are many that are trying to rush towards self-service sort of offerings. Given you've seen a lot of different companies in this space, and one of your colleagues was on one of my old boards, and we felt like we had to rush into self-service. How do you help advise companies sort of think through sales team versus self-service and how that evolves as a business?
You starting with me?
Sure, why not?
So I look at this. It doesn't necessarily just apply to MarTech. It applies to in general when we think about market segmentation. So very simply put, if something looks like a utility, something that does not require the value exchange between a vendor and a customer to be terribly complex. So let's take an example: payment service, electricity, internet access. That's a pure form of utility. It really kind of gets it. You don't need to educate the market. You can market a product like that. You can make it self-serve. If it's highly complex, I'm trying to sell ERP to Fortune 500, that's a fairly complex product, has to be sold. That's not going to be self-serve. Now you can talk about whether you've made the product for adoption, self-serve product design helps with that. But from a business model standpoint, if you're going to sell to mid-enterprise, I don't believe in self-serve. And so it depends on what product you have, what market you're trying, what value proposition you have, and is it suitable for the mode of distribution. So that's kind of how we look at it. If you tell me that you're building the next marketing automation solution that's multi-channel, requires data integration and all that, and then you have fantasies around self-service, I'd say there's lots of other VCs you can go convince. I don't think anybody here would say that, but yeah.
Well, I don't think there's many companies that are in the marketing sphere that are purely self-service. I mean, there are ones that might be easy to get up and running, but I think there's still some level of introduction, I mean, to the customer to figure out how to use it, how to use the platform to educate them, make sure you're high on the priority list to, for that marketer to get it up and running.
Yeah, I think the instinct is right. I think the application may not always be correct. I think reducing friction from your product and your onboarding makes all the sense in the world. Similar to Stacey's comment, we love the lower mid-market because you go in there with great product. Your customers generally aren't siloed, and they tend to grow very quickly because that's where a lot of the innovation is. And as your product gets better, you can scale with it. That happened with ExactTarget, happened with Sitecore, happened with various other players. And so that isn't self-service SMB. That's lower mid-market where there is some services.
Yep.
Great. So the other sort of, let's say, theme I got from polling the audience earlier was around the frustration with Brian talked about it this morning, the convergence of marketing technology and advertising technology. Curious your thoughts on sort of what that looks like, why is it not moving faster, and what are some things that could cause it to accelerate? Doug, you want to?
Yeah, I don't have it. I mean, it's something we've been talking about for a long time. As Brian joked, I think he showed that slide last 3 years in a row. I mean, it is clearly happening.
Sure.
It's happening with large companies.
Yeah, large acquisitions.
Like Salesforce and Oracle and others making big acquisitions. And I think a lot of that is wanting to bring that data of unknown customers into their existing solutions. And so, I think the reason it's taken longer than we expected is that those are big decisions and hard things to accomplish, to bring those companies on board and then integrate them successfully and actually have it work. And so it's a big vision, big idea, and by definition, that takes time.
I think it absolutely should happen. I think CMOs want it. And you look at business models of marketing tech companies like ExactTarget, we had a subscription SaaS model, but we charged on a CPM. There was overages, and so tell me how that isn't a media-based model. It's very similar. I think the reasons why it hasn't occurred is DNA. I think ad DNA and media DNA is very different from enterprise software DNA. So if you think about building a Salesforce, if you even think about the networks and the language that you engage in, there's pretty big differences. Obviously, with the public players, business model is a huge issue. I think the CFO of Salesforce, the CFO of Oracle, those folks, I think they have a hard time communicating their P&L in the context of both models. It's starting to change. I think Salesforce's acquisition of Crux was great, and I think that's a gateway into potentially media over time. Adobe just bought TubeMogul, and so they're doing great things. And so I think this is, I think over the course of time, this will happen because it serves customers.
Right, and I think one of the challenges that you mentioned too is just DNA, but also the way the customers buy. Media is often bought on a campaign basis versus subscription basis, and just handling both those two business models can kind of be a challenge.
I thought one of the most interesting sessions earlier today was the account-based marketing, but unfortunately it was up against AI, so it was sort of B2B marketing, typically unloved. Any perspectives from your aspect on sort of the B2B MarTech world? Dave, you moved, so I'm throwing it to you.
I flinched.
Yeah, exactly. You're up.
Yeah, account-based marketing, I think it makes a lot of sense. In general, it's think about a 10-year trend of marketing substituting for sales and software. You look at the high multiple market cap software companies, they generally are high velocity models where online marketing and marketing generally drives a lot of the go-to-market versus sales, at least versus companies of 10 years ago. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I think the two complexities are it's really hard. If you think about marketers still using agencies for retargeting, you think about account-based marketing and long consideration cycles, really tough attribution models. It's really hard for marketers to get up to speed on that. These are, while online marketing can dramatically accelerate a sales cycle, ultimately it's consummated by sales. And so the DNA of many B2B companies are very sales-oriented. The attribution's tough, and so it'll take some time, but I think some of the vendors that we've been talking to are really interesting. I think LinkedIn being bought by Microsoft is going to move it dramatically forward. And so I suspect it will be a big opportunity over time.
Yeah, and I also, just to add to that, when I think of our portfolio companies and how they're selling, so many are shifting. They've always been selling on an account basis, but they hadn't been thinking that way. And it's kind of a new term, but a company, Demandbase, was on that panel, their portfolio company. They've been doing it for years, and then the category kind of emerged with a name attached to it, which has been great. But just when I think of all of our portfolio companies and how they're selling to customers, it's not like you're selling to a lead. You're selling to a whole company, and you need to get that perspective of what the whole company is doing and who are all those constituents that need to be part of the process.
Great.
I have a slightly different view. I do agree with sort of looking at the world not as leads and looking at it as accounts, but I go back to, again, are you selling a utility or are you selling something that's more complex? More complex something is, the more it requires human interaction, and selling is a human process. And so I think in order for account-based marketing and that sort of idea to really take hold and fruition, you also need innovation on the sales side. And the sales side and the sales tech, the sales stack has really not seen much innovation because everybody thinks that the big gorilla, Salesforce.com, is taking that space and there's no opportunity for innovation. But as most of you probably can attest to, I don't think any one of you have salespeople who actually like using the product.
Right.
And I don't mean it doesn't add value, et cetera, but salespeople don't use it. So I think there is a huge opportunity in sort of thinking about that world and how that ties to marketing. And ultimately, it's about solving the whole end-to-end problem of going to customers, right? So.
Well, we agree as we have just released our first sales technology, LumaScape, and actually have some more content coming out related to that. So that was a wonderful tee-up that I'll buy you a drink, actually, on that. And actually, we're going to end it early so we can buy all of y'all a drink. So let's thank the panel, Doug, Dave, Stacey, and Rajeev. Thank you guys very much.